The Morning Forbes named him Industrialist of the Decade. Lawrence Holt stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Boston office and felt absolutely nothing. Below him, the city moved the way it always did. Taxis cutting through intersections, pedestrians bent against the November wind, the whole ordinary machinery of other people's lives grinding forward without him. He had a coffee going cold on his desk. He had a board meeting in 40 minutes. He had, by every external measure, won. And somewhere across town, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair, his 11-year-old son was forgetting how to breathe on his own. That was the thing about success Lawrence had come to understand. It didn't insulate you. It just gave you a better view of everything you stood to lose. His son's name was Noah. Dark-haired, gap-toothed, obsessed with baseball statistics and the particular way light moved through a prism. He had his mother's laugh, that quick, surprised sound, like she'd caught herself being happy. Lawrence hadn't heard it in 4 months. Noah hadn't laughed in 4 months. Noah hadn't done much of anything in 4 months except lie in that bed, while the machines around him kept quiet, careful count of the ways his body was failing. The diagnosis had come in July, on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong somehow. Terrible news should arrive on a more dramatic day. Dr. Randall Keefe, chief of pediatric neurology at Massachusetts General, had sat across from Lawrence in a small conference room and used words like progressive and degenerative and no established treatment protocol. The condition was called cortical synapse deterioration syndrome, CSDS, a rare neurological disorder in which the synaptic connections in the brain's cortex began without warning and without mercy to dissolve. It affected roughly 1 in 4 million children. It had no cure. The medical literature on it could fit inside a thin folder, which Dr. Keefe had, in fact, placed on the table between them. Lawrence had looked at that folder for a long time. "What do we do?" he finally said. It wasn't really a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. Dr. Keefe had clasped his hands together. "We keep him comfortable. We monitor. We hope the progression slows." He paused. "Mr. Holt, I want to be honest with you. The trajectory we're seeing, in most cases, the window is somewhere between 6 and 18 months before the deterioration becomes—" "Don't," Lawrence said. Keefe stopped. "Don't finish that sentence." He had flown in 3 other neurologists after that. One from Johns Hopkins, one from the Mayo Clinic, one from a research hospital in Zurich, who had been studying CSDS longer than anyone in the world. They had all reviewed Noah's charts. They had all sat across from Lawrence in that same small conference room. They had all clasped their hands the same way. There was nothing to do. That was the consensus. There was nothing left to do. Lawrence had gone home that night to his Beacon Hill townhouse, the one with the mahogany staircase and the kitchen that had been featured in Architectural Digest, and sat on the floor of his son's empty bedroom until 3 in the morning. He sat among Noah's baseball cards and his science fair ribbons and a half-built model of the solar system that would never be finished now, and he thought, "I have more money than I will ever spend in this lifetime, and I cannot buy my son one more day." That understanding broke something in him, not loudly, quietly, like a hinge giving way. His ex-wife, Margot, had moved back from Seattle the moment she heard. They weren't together anymore, hadn't been for 3 years, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was Noah. She stayed in a hotel 4 blocks from the hospital and was there every morning before Lawrence arrived, sitting beside the bed with her hand over Noah's, talking to him in a low, steady voice about anything and everything, as if she could tether him to the world through sheer will and words. Lawrence admired that about her. He'd never been good at talking to fill silence. He tended to fill it with action instead. Phone calls, research, wire transfers to research foundations. He had funded a CSDS study at Harvard Medical School. He had offered a private grant to any research team that could show meaningful progress within 18 months. He had called in every favor from every contact he'd built over 30 years of business. None of it moved the needle. By October, Noah could no longer sit up on his own. By early November, he was having difficulty tracking movement with his eyes. Dr. Keefe had spoken gently about making arrangements, about quality of life, about what the coming months would look like and how the family could best prepare. Lawrence had listened to all of it with his jaw set and his hands flat on his knees, and then he had walked out of the hospital and driven to the waterfront and sat in his car watching the harbor for 2 hours, not thinking about anything at all. He was parked near the fish pier when he first saw her. She was maybe 10 or 11, crouched beside a cracked concrete planter near the harbor walk, doing something with her hands that he couldn't immediately make out. She wore a blue winter coat that was 2 sizes too big for her, the sleeves rolled up at the cuffs. Her hair was dark and pulled back with what appeared to be a rubber band from a bunch of broccoli. She had a backpack with a broken zipper held shut with a safety pin. As Lawrence watched, she carefully unwrapped a bundle of dried herbs from a piece of cloth and laid them out on the edge of the planter with the systematic focus of a scientist. She was humming something to herself. An old song. He couldn't place it, but it had that quality of something learned young, something passed down. He might have driven away. He'd been doing that lately, noticing things at the edges of his vision and then letting them go, too wrung out to engage with the world outside Noah's hospital room. But something made him lower his window. "What are you doing?" he asked. She looked up without alarm. Kids who'd grown up careful tended not to startle easily. "Sorting," she said. "These have to stay separate from these ones, or they lose their properties." Properties. Medicinal properties. She said it plainly, the way you'd say obviously without being rude about it. Grandma Cleo says if you mix them wrong before you dry them, they cancel each other out. Lawrence looked at the herbs. He had no idea what any of them were. "Your grandmother teaches you that?" "Taught." The girl's hands paused for just a moment on the dried bundle. "She passed in September, but I have her notebooks." She went back to sorting. Lawrence sat with that for a moment. This child, alone by the harbor, sorting medicinal herbs from a dead woman's notebooks in a coat too big for her, humming an old song. The world was full of quiet griefs that never made it into conference rooms or headlines. "I'm Lawrence," he said. She glanced up again. "I know who you are. Your picture is on the building over there." She nodded toward the Holt Capitol building, 2 blocks east, where his name did, in fact, appear on a steel placard near the entrance. He almost smiled. "Almost. And you are?" "Willa," she said. Willa Mae Boone. Her mother's name was Cecilia Cease to everyone who knew her. She worked double shifts at a diner in South Boston, which was why Willa spent most afternoons at the harbor walk or the library rather than home. Not because home was unsafe. Their apartment was small but clean, but because Willa understood, at 10 years old, that her mother needed quiet when she got in, and the best gift she could give was to not require anything for a few hours. Lawrence didn't learn all of this at once. He learned it in pieces over the following week because he came back. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Maybe because Willa was the first person he'd talked to in months who hadn't looked at him with the particular exhausted tenderness of someone who knew about Noah. She looked at him like a person, which was more than he could say for most of his interactions lately. People who knew about Noah, and most people did, because money and tragedy both travel fast in this city, tended to look at him with a kind of careful sorrow, the way you look at something fragile that you're afraid to jostle. Willa had no such hesitation. She argued with him about baseball statistics. She corrected him, once on the medicinal history of elderflower, with the serene confidence of someone who was simply right and expected him to catch up. She showed him her grandmother's notebooks, 2 composition books, filled with handwriting so small and dense it looked like a secret code, and explained the logic of Cleo Boone's system with a precision that would have impressed Lawrence's research team. It was on the 4th afternoon, sitting on a bench near the harbor, that Lawrence told her about Noah. He hadn't planned to. He'd planned, in fact, not to keep that separate, to let this strange, small friendship exist in some protected space outside the weight of it all. But Willa had asked him, directly and without preamble, why he always looked like he was underwater. "My son is sick," he said. "The doctors can't fix it." Willa was quiet for a moment. The harbor moved behind her, gray and glittering. "What kind of sick?" she asked. He told her. He used the medical terms, and then, because she was watching him with those serious brown eyes, he translated them into plain language. The synapses, the connections dissolving, the brain unable to hold itself together. Willa thought about this. She picked up a small stone from the path and turned it over in her hands. "Grandma Cleo had something like that," she said finally. "Not the same, but something in the brain that the doctors said they couldn't do anything about. She had it for 6 years. Lawrence went still. "She used," Willa stopped, choosing words carefully. "She called it integrated stimulation. It was physical, moving the limbs in specific patterns, and botanical compounds, specific ones, taken together in a specific order. And sound." She said the brain responds to sound in ways doctors don't fully understand yet. Willa glanced up at him. She wasn't a doctor. She was just someone who paid attention. Did it work? Lawrence asked. His voice was careful, controlled. He was a man who had learned to be very careful about hope. She lived to 78, Willa said. The neurologist who diagnosed her gave her 2 years. Lawrence stared at the harbor for a long time. The notebooks, he said finally. Everything she knew, it's in those notebooks. Most of it. The rest is in my head. He could feel his hands trembling. Not from cold. He pressed them flat against his thighs. Willa, he said slowly, would you be willing to help me? She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something old and assessing in it. Something that had nothing to do with being 10 years old. You'd have to let me actually do it, she said. Not have your doctors explain to me why it won't work. Actually let me try. Yes, he said, and you'd have to tell them to stop interrupting. Yes, she considered this. Okay, she said, but I'd need to talk to my mom first. Seaspoon took one look at Lawrence Holt in her small South Boston kitchen. This man in his expensive coat standing beside her daughter, holding both of Grandma Cleo's notebooks with the particular reverence you only give things that matter. And she knew what her answer was before he'd finished explaining. She also knew that the world was full of people willing to use a child's knowledge and give nothing back. My daughter isn't a show, she said. She's not a curiosity. If she helps your son, she helps him because it's the right thing to do, not because of whatever reward you're thinking about offering. I understand, Lawrence said. Do you? Cece looked at him steadily. She had her mother's eyes, that same direct, measuring quality. Because I've worked in diners my whole life, and I've watched what happens when rich men decide that poor people's things are actually valuable. They take them, they rename them, they put them in a patent. She paused. Cleo's notebooks stay with Willa. Absolutely, Lawrence said, without question. Cece was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at her daughter. Willa gave a small nod. They came the next morning. Cece had called in a favor from a co-worker to cover her shift. Willa carried both notebooks and a canvas bag with the herbs she'd need, sorted, bundled, labeled in her grandmother's handwriting. Lawrence had arranged for them to have full access to Noah's room. Dr. Keefe was waiting in the hallway when they arrived. He was a careful man, a thorough man, and he had spent 22 years practicing evidence-based medicine. He looked at the girl with the canvas bag and the composition notebooks, and Lawrence could see the thing happening behind his eyes. The professional courtesy fighting with the professional skepticism. Mr. Holt, he said carefully, I understand you're exploring options. I want to support whatever brings you comfort. But I do need to be clear that there's no peer-reviewed evidence for. I know, Lawrence said. I've read everything with peer review. I need you to step back. A pause. Lawrence, Randy. Lawrence met his eyes. I need you to step back. Keefe stepped back. The room was quiet except for the monitors when Willa walked in. She stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, looking at Noah. Really looking, the way people rarely looked at sick children, with directness instead of the sideways flinching glance of someone afraid of being caught, staring at suffering. Hi, she said, to Noah. Not to the room, to him. The monitors kept their steady rhythm. My name is Willa. I'm going to sit with you for a while. You don't have to do anything. She set her bag down and pulled up the chair and opened the first notebook to a page near the middle. I'm going to talk to you and move your hands and arms around and play some music. Is that okay? The monitors kept counting. Noah's chest rose and fell. Willa took it as yes. What she did over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic. That was the thing Lawrence had not expected. He'd expected something to happen. Something visible and conclusive, the way breakthroughs happened in movies, all at once and unmistakably. What happened instead was quiet, incremental, easy to dismiss on any given day, which was exactly what several members of the hospital staff tried to do. Willa came every afternoon from 3 to 6. She worked through the movements in Cleo's notebooks, a specific sequence of passive mobilizations, beginning with the fingers and working up through the wrist, elbow, shoulder, always in the same order, always slow. She talked while she worked, a low, steady narration about anything she happened to be thinking about, a book she'd read, a bird she'd seen at the harbor, a fact about light refraction she thought Noah might appreciate. She played music on a small Bluetooth speaker she'd brought, old gospel, jazz with a specific rhythmic pattern, A particular frequency of piano that Cleo had noted in her cramped handwriting seemed to produce measurable responses in patients who were otherwise unresponsive. She prepared the botanical compound each evening at Lawrence's townhouse, which Cece supervised with the same methodical care she gave everything. A specific combination, valerian, lion's mane mushroom, bacopa, two others that grew in a window box in their apartment and didn't have names that Lawrence could find in any database. Measured by weight, combined in a specific order, steeped for a precise number of minutes. The nursing staff administered it with the wariness of people who knew they were being watched and didn't want to be blamed for what happened either way. Dr. Keefe reviewed Noah's charts each morning. He didn't say anything about improvement. He also stopped saying anything about arrangements. On the 18th day, Margot called Lawrence at 7 in the morning. "Come," she said. Now, he was there in 11 minutes. Noah's eyes were open. Not the unfocused open of the past weeks, not the glazed partial opening that meant nothing, that the monitors tracked and the nurses noted without marking as improvement. This was different. This was Noah looking at the ceiling and then slowly turning his head when Lawrence walked through the door. Looking at him. Really looking. "Dad," Noah said. His voice was rough from disuse, scraped thin, barely above a whisper, but it was his voice, and it said that word. Lawrence sat down on the edge of the bed. He picked up his son's hand. He could feel his own heartbeat in his throat, in his palms, everywhere. "Hey, buddy," he managed. Noah stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I was dreaming about baseball." His eyes tracked slowly around the room, gathering details, stopped on something. "Who's the kid?" Lawrence turned. Willa was in the doorway, still in her coat, the canvas bag over her shoulder. She must have come in just behind him. She had both notebooks pressed to her chest and an expression on her face that was very carefully not a smile, as though she was holding it back the way you hold back something that might come out too big. "That's Willa," Lawrence said. "She's been sitting with you." Noah looked at her for a moment with the evaluating gaze of an 11-year-old. "You like baseball?" he asked. Willa considered this with great seriousness. "I like the statistics," she said. "The game itself is very slow." Noah stared at her. Then, for the first time in 4 months and 12 days, Lawrence heard his son laugh, that quick, surprised sound, just like his mother's. Dr. Keefe ordered a full workup that afternoon. He stood in the hallway afterward with Lawrence, looking at the scan results on his tablet, with the specific expression of a careful, thorough man encountering something that did not fit neatly into his framework. "The synaptic activity," he said slowly, scrolling. "The density of connection here and here." He stopped, shook his head slowly. "I can't explain this, I know," Lawrence said. "The botanical compounds alone wouldn't." He stopped again. "And the stimulation protocol, it resembles elements of emerging physical therapy approaches, but combined in a way that—" He set the tablet down and looked at Lawrence directly. "I don't know what to tell you. You don't have to tell me anything," Lawrence said. "You could tell her." Keefe followed his gaze through the window to the hospital room, where Willa sat beside Noah's bed, both of them bent over a notebook, his baseball cards, her grandmother's handwriting, their heads close together, like they were already old friends. Keefe was quiet for a long moment. "Those notebooks," he said finally. "The methodology in them, has anyone ever reviewed them formally? Because what I'm looking at in these scans suggests that there might be something worth." He caught himself. Adjusted. "I'd like to learn more, if she'd be willing." Lawrence thought about Cece Boone in her small kitchen. "They take them, they rename them, they put them in a patent. You'd have to ask her," he said, "and her mother, and they get to set the terms." Keefe nodded slowly. Of course. Recovery was not a straight line. Lawrence had spent enough time in hospitals to know that, and still the setbacks were brutal in a way he hadn't prepared himself for. The days when Noah's progress seemed to stall, when the weariness in his eyes came back like a tide, when Willa arrived with her notebooks and her canvas bag and worked for 3 hours and nothing seemed to shift. Those nights, Lawrence sat in the kitchen of his townhouse and stared at his cold coffee and reminded himself what the baseline had been, what nothing left to do had looked like. Cece started joining Willa at the hospital on her days off. She brought food, not hospital food, real food, the kind that required actual cooking, because she'd decided that Lawrence and Margot both looked like they'd forgotten to eat. She'd set something on the small table in Noah's room, without comment, and returned to her chair. And after a few days, Lawrence noticed that this was simply something that happened now. That Cece Boone fed people the way other people breathed, reflexively, without making a production of it. Margot and Cece developed a friendship that surprised everyone, including themselves. Two women with almost nothing in common except the particular education that comes from making difficult things work with whatever materials are at hand. They talked for hours some afternoons while Willa worked, and Noah slept, voices low, the easy back and forth of people who'd decided to skip the pleasantries. By December, Noah was sitting up on his own. By Christmas, he was walking the hospital corridor with Willa on one side and Lawrence on the other, moving slowly, one hand trailing the wall, but moving, putting one foot in front of the other down a fluorescent hallway, while a nurse watched from the station with an expression she hadn't been trained to show on duty. On Christmas Eve, someone had put a small tree at the end of the corridor. Blinking lights, a few paper ornaments. Noah stopped in front of it. He looked at it for a moment. "The red lights," he said, "are reflecting off the floor tiles and making the walls look pink." Lawrence looked. They were. "Like a prism," Noah said. Lawrence had to look away for a moment. He looked at the wall, at the pink-tinted tiles, and breathed. "Yeah," he said, "like a prism." In February, Noah came home. Not to the Beacon Hill townhouse at first. The townhouse had too many stairs, and his stamina wasn't there yet. Lawrence rented a ground-floor house in Brookline. One-story wide doorways, a yard with a bird feeder that Willa had insisted on, because she said birds were good for healing, and she had a notebook page from Cleo to back her up. He couldn't argue with the notebook. The discharge paperwork had a section for the attending physician to note the primary intervention that resulted in improvement. Dr. Keefe had stared at that section for a long time. Then he'd written in his precise, careful handwriting, Integrated Neurostimulation Protocol, methodology developed by Cleo Boone, implemented by Willa Mae Boone in collaboration with medical staff. He'd shown it to Lawrence before filing it. Lawrence had nodded. "Thank you," he said, "for writing it that way." "It's accurate," Keefe said simply. The research partnership had begun by then, a formal arrangement, documents drawn up by Lawrence's legal team and reviewed by an attorney Cece had chosen herself, which had taken 3 weeks of back and forth and which Lawrence had found, to his genuine surprise, clarifying. The terms were Cece's. The notebooks remained with Willa. Any research derived from Cleo Boone's methodology would be attributed to her by name. Willa would be credited as a co-developer of the protocol. A foundation, the Cleo Boone Foundation for Integrative Neurology, Cece's idea, Lawrence's funding, would support both the research and the education of practitioners in approaches that fell outside conventional clinical frameworks. It was not a perfect arrangement. Nothing was, but it was honest, and it was theirs. On the first Saturday in March, Lawrence drove to the Harbor Walk for the first time since November. He parked in the same spot where he'd first seen her. The city moved the way it always did, ordinary and different, grinding forward. The harbor was silver-gray in the morning light. He heard them before he saw them. Willa and Noah, 10 feet ahead on the path, deep in what appeared to be an argument about the designated hitter rule that had clearly been going for some time. Noah was gesturing with his whole arm, the arm that had been still for 4 months, and Willa was shaking her head with the serene patience of someone who was right and knew it, and was content to wait for the universe to catch up. Behind them, Cece and Margot walked side by side, talking in low voices, and Cece laughed at something, that quick surprised sound, and Margot laughed too, and the wind off the harbor carried it back to where Lawrence stood. He thought about the floor-to-ceiling window, the Forbes cover, the cold coffee and the 40-minute board meeting, and the feeling of having won everything and felt nothing. He thought about a girl crouched by a planter, sorting herbs with careful hands. He thought about Cleo Boone, who was never in a conference room, never at a podium, never in any room where things were officially decided, who had simply paid attention, for decades, to what the body needed, and had written it down in small, cramped handwriting in 2 composition books, and had passed those books to her granddaughter, and who had saved his son's life from 6 years in the past, without ever knowing she would. Lawrence started walking toward them. Willa turned. She had that quality, that awareness, and spotted him. She said something to Noah, who turned too. Noah's face did the thing it always did now, the easy, unguarded openness that Lawrence had been afraid he'd never see again. He raised one hand in a wave, just that. Just his son's hand in the morning air, his boy who was alive and arguing about baseball and walking on his own along the harbor where the light was coming in off the water in a way that, if you looked at it right, made everything look like it was glowing. Lawrence raised his hand back. Some things he had finally understood could not be bought or researched or willed into being by a man with enough resources and enough contacts and enough desperate determination. Some things came quietly, in the form of a child with a broken zippered backpack and 2 notebooks full of her grandmother's wisdom, crouching by a harbor planter in November, just paying attention to what the world had already given her. He walked forward into the morning, and the city moved around them all. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.